begin, I'd like to start in a good way and acknowledge that we come together today as learners, and many of us are also visitors to this land. The University of British Columbia is located on the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territory of the Musqueam people. And I'd like to acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and the Musqueam people who have been stewards of this land since the beginning and continue to do so through the generations. This land has always been a place of learning for children. The land is the classroom and all that is in it, like the trees and the rocks and the insects are the teachers. In this spirit is my hope and commitment that today we honor the learning that has gone before us as we strive for truth and reconciliation and look towards decolonization of our early childhood education programming, where Indigenous knowledge systems are valued and the principles of First Peoples learnings will shape the culture, identity, and sense of belonging through the holistic development of the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being of all children, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, as we look towards the future. So if you'd just like to take a moment in the chat to honor the territory and the lands that you're joining us from, please feel free to do so. So having said that, my name is Shannon Braden, and I'm the director of the Center for Early Childhood Education and Research in the Faculty of Education at UBC. So I would just like to take a moment to also introduce a couple of people. To start, I'd like to say good morning to Dr. Laurie Ford, who you'll see is on Zoom with us. Dr. Ford is the director of the Early Childhood Education Program at UBC. I'd also like to take this moment to introduce Dr. Jennifer Jensen, who is the director of the Edith Lando Center for Virtual Learning. So, and you can see she's here with us this morning too. So on behalf of Drs. Ford, Jensen, and myself, we would really like to welcome you to the second session in our 2021-2022 professional development series. We're extremely excited to be offering this session and extremely excited with the support from the recently launched Edith Lando Virtual Learning Center through UBC's Faculty of Education. The center's mandate is to design and make freely available leading-edge learning tools to communicate to meet communities who are most overlooked and underserved by online education by reaching rural and remote communities, Indigenous learners, early childhood, immigrant and refugees, and learners with special needs. In a moment, I'll put in the chat the link to the Edith Lando Virtual Learning Center, and I welcome everyone to check it out. So today's session is on engaging with critical childhood, and I hope that you're looking forward to collaboratively engaging in dialogue that reflects on early childhood education practice. Today's session will draw on current scholarship, the British Columbia's early learning framework, and pedagogical narration, all while considering ways of knowing, learning, and living that are local, inclusive, ethical, and democratic. So on that note, I'd like to now introduce Dr. Irish Berger, who is an assistant professor of teaching in the Faculty of Education at UBC. Dr. Berger's career has been dedicated to the field of early childhood education as a classroom teacher, researcher, policy consultant, and university instructor. So I'd like to thank Dr. Berger for contributions to the development of this year's professional development series, and Dr. Berger will facilitate today's session. So now I would like to hand over the screen to Dr. Berger so she can introduce today's outstanding speaker. So once again, thank you for joining us today, and please enjoy the morning. Dr. Berger.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for starting us in such a good way. And good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the session engaging with critical reflection in early childhood education. As Shannon said, my name is Iris Berger, and I'm absolutely honored to be here with you and to introduce our speaker today. I do want to acknowledge that I am joining you today from the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Kim Atkinson. I first met Kim over 10 years ago when she was, along with Danielle Davis, launching a traveling exhibit called The Images of Learning, a project that collected pedagogical narratives from across BC to make visible the competencies of children and the complexity of the pedagogical practice and knowledge of early childhood educators. I was immediately struck by Kim's wisdom, the clarity of her thought, and the power in her words. These were all woven together around her desire to disrupt reductionist ideas of what early childhood education is about, and challenging all of us to think what it might be. Kim has extensive experience working as an early childhood educator. After leading a parent participation preschool on Vancouver Island for many, many years, Kim joined the Investigating Quality Research Project and became a pedagogical facilitator. In this role, Kim acted as a provocateur, or an agent of change, inviting and supporting early childhood educators to engage in critical reflection and transform their practice. In her numerous publications, Kim has shown an unparalleled talent to weave together theory and practice around stories of every day about children, educators, their relationships with each other, with nature, and with materials, always finding the extraordinary in the ordinary. In 2018, Kim has become the author of the BC Early Learning Framework, and we're very grateful that this beautiful document was trusted in such capable hands. And just before I pass the screen over to you, Kim, I just wanted to talk about, rather than housekeeping, Zoom keeping. And the chat will be open for you to post your questions. And we have two graduate students today with us, Nora and Irina, and they will be monitoring the chat and helping us throughout the morning with all kinds of Zoom options. There will be an opportunity for you to share your thoughts in breakout room a little bit later, and I know Kim is going to talk about that as well. And of course, we're going to ask you to keep your mics muted so that we wouldn't be there wouldn't be interference by all kinds of outside noises. So with that, again, a very warm welcome to everybody and to you, Kim, and I'm passing it over.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Iris. I'm so humbled by that. It was so beautifully done. I really appreciate that. And I'd like to tell everybody all the beautiful work that you've done over the many, many years that we've known each other. But suffice to say that I've been very inspired by your work about using pedagogical narration in ways that develop leadership and the potentials for that. Your work has inspired me in so many ways. Right back to an early article you did many years ago on literacy, which still is a very relevant and inspiring article from a long time ago. So thank you so much for that. It's a very great pleasure to be here with all of you today. And particularly since the sun is out, and I know that it hasn't been out for a long time, and the fact that you've joined us this morning, despite the beautiful weather, so is really an honor. So I appreciate that very much. So I just want to, as Iris said, just give a quick outline about what to expect for the next couple of hours, how we're going to roll this out. I'm going to talk a little bit about the early learning framework, about some of the bigger ideas that have come out of the early learning framework. And of course, this session is called Critical Reflection in Early Childhood Education. So we'll certainly discuss what we mean by that. We'll also talk about some of the other processes that we use alongside critical reflection to think about early childhood education, and some of the issues that we can lend our critical eye to, some things that I think are important to think about with a critical lens. And then I will be offering a pedagogical narration for your consideration, and we will be going into breakout groups to have some time to discuss the pedagogical narration. And as Iris also said, we're going to leave time, a good chunk of time at the end, for questions and answers, or maybe not answers, certainly questions. We'll see about the answers. And certainly I know that there's people that will be reading and monitoring the chat, so questions can go into there as well. So I'm going to share my screen. We're in?
Yes, you're good, Kim.
Okay, great. So this is engaging with critical reflection in early childhood. Okay. So that, of course, is the cover of the early learning framework, which we will be drawing on for this session, as well as other scholarship. So I just want to start by with the vision of the early learning framework. So this vision of respectfully living and learning together is important to me in a lot of ways. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can think about that statement. And to begin with, it doesn't tell this. The early learning framework is a document that for early childhood educators, but it doesn't, and about curriculum, but this vision doesn't place educators as telling children how they should be. It doesn't say educators should be like this. This vision doesn't say children should be learning about such and such. Children should be doing this in these particular ways, or adults should be doing these in any particular way. This vision flattens that hierarchy and puts us all in this together, living and learning together with respect. So it's really thinking about co-constructing knowledge and learning together without that hierarchy of teacher and child or adult and child. And the other important thing about this vision that I think is made evident by this photograph, which was very, I took this photograph and I put it with the vision in the framework very specifically because it has adult hands, it has children's hands, but it also has the snail and the worms. And that to me was really an important reminder that we're respectfully living and learning together, not just with the other humans in our communities and our world, but with the non-living entities in our world as well. The worms, the ants, the slugs, the snails, the creatures, all the other creatures, the trees, the water, the air, everything else in this that we have, these non-living entities that we live with in place. We can be thinking about respectfully living and learning together alongside those non-human entities. So I think this vision is something that's really key to the framework, that we can continue to ground us and remind us of what we're doing and why we're doing it.
So there you go.
Yeah, there it is. So the early learning framework is an invitation to re-envision early year spaces, education systems, and society. It is intended to promote dialogue about understandings of childhood, knowledge, education, and learning. And this is I think, quite a bold statement for a curriculum document. We're not just talking about early year spaces, of course we are talking about that, but it goes beyond that to think about, to re-envision education systems generally, all like across the board, and society. We're not just talking about education, just about education. We're also just talking about re-envisioning society through education. So that's a very bold statement. This document has a big vision, a big purpose. And so how do we do that? The early learning framework tells us that we want to do this by talking together, by promoting dialogue, in conversations about challenging ourselves to think about understandings of childhood, knowledge, education, and learning. So this is a bold document that is really envisioning some big ideas and some big an invitation to really think deeply and differently about how we do education, particularly within early childhood, but beyond. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about, of course, is critical reflection. We're talking about this we don't want to just talk about understandings of childhood, knowledge, education, and learning. We want to really think about critically looking at them. So critical reflection involves thinking carefully about fundamental beliefs that shape our senses of self and others and how we view the world. So, for example, I think this photograph is an example of how something we might critically reflect on. This child is walking along this beam in bare feet. Below the beam are a lot of loose parts that are somewhat jumbled and perhaps not typical early childhood materials. So how we look at that photograph, how we think about that, can be a reflection of how we view childhood, about what we think children are capable of, about what we think our role as educators are, about what we think children can do, about what education is about. So it's those fundamental beliefs that we hold about childhood, about education, and about materials, about early childhood education can impact and be reflected in how we respond in these moments where these kind of moments come up within childcare programs. So critically reflecting on those beliefs that we hold, we can begin to disentangle where those beliefs come from and think critically about them and open ourselves to thinking in different and new ways. So critical reflection is about seeking many perspectives on the truths about teaching and learning and turning the notion of truth itself towards a process of collective research to reconstruct and reinvent what educators can do, who they are, who they can be, and open different ways of thinking. So we have many truths in our early childhood programs, things that have just been handed down from generation to generation that we just sort of assume to be true. And so thinking very critically about those truths and where they come from, how they have come to be thought of as truths, as the norm, as the way to do things, and turning that notion of truth around, as this phrase says from the framework, towards a process of collective research together. So one of the things that I would think it's interesting to put our critically reflective lens on is the idea of quality. We use the term quality, we hear the term quality all the time, particularly now in documents and policies. The high quality early childhood education is that term comes up all the time. But what do we mean by quality? So I think it's interesting to put that critical lens on quality and what quality has been attached to in those policy documents is that as indicators that are quality as indicators that are universal and measurable: adult-child ratio, early childhood education, standardized outcomes for children, meaning measurable skills that can be mastered, routines for children that are predictable and follow routines that are the same day by day, week by week, month by month, and a predictable environment where early childhood spaces are seen as quality if they have blocks, if they have puzzles, if they have a house corner, if they have trucks and cars and some Play-Doh. So these quality indicators are all measurable, but to be blunt, the goal of quality in this model is to keep children busy while adhering to health and safety standards. So, and that fits very nicely within the current narratives of early childhood education in Canada, where ECE in Canada is seen as a service model, which is an economic transaction between parents and service providers who care for their children. And if there's funding coming from a governmental source, it's always considered an investment. And the investment is intended to get high returns on that investment with improved educational and economic performance. So improved educational performance for children, meaning that they will do better at school, meaning that they will have good grades, again, something that is measurable, skills that can be mastered that are measurable, and economic performance, meaning that those children will go on to be good workers and perform within the economy. And as well, this is all the investment is also to have parents, particularly women, be out in the workforce and therefore enabling the economy good economic performance in the workforce as well. So this investment in quality is about future citizens. It's about creating the good children into good future citizens, good future workers. So this is how quality has been thought about within Canada. But in these times where the federal and provincial governments are investing in early childhood education and universal programs, it's very important that we have conversations about what that means, and if this is the kind of model that we think really does produce a quality early childhood program. These narratives are universal, so these narratives make the application of these quality measurements universalize them throughout Canada. So there is nothing local about these narratives. These narratives do not allow for any deepening of pedagogical thought. It doesn't allow for thinking about the educational values. We know that education can be very positive conduit for really positive social change, for social justice. But these narratives of early childhood education do not create any space for those kinds of conversations. They don't create any space for conversations about the world that in the 21st century that our children are inheriting. They don't allow space for engagement in conversation about climate change, about racism, about what we can contribute to truth and reconciliation. So there's no space in these for considering the value of education, the value of particularly early childhood education as a way for our children to think critically and effectively and differently about the world that they are inheriting. There we go. I'm sorry about this. So quality in ECE is not applying universal best practice to every program. Quality requires engaging with everyday moments, the living, the doing, the being. Quality is engaging in pedagogical processes that are localized, to think together, to co-construct knowledge and challenge assumption. Qualities is imagining new possibilities. So quality in this model is local, is the communities, the early childhood educators, the children, the families, thinking together about the issues that are relevant in their communities, in their place, in their lands, with their histories. It's about recognizing the small moments in their land, in their place, that are meaningful, and paying attention to those moments, and in ways that are democratic and experimental and innovative and meaningful and relevant to the place and the people that are in those programs. So that is what quality, we see quality as. And it is not something that can be applied universally across every childcare program in the country. So I think that this conversation is a really important one, and I think it's particularly important right here or right now. So this leads us to think about theory and practice, that those ideas of quality and what we think about quality and what model of quality we're looking at really translates into how we practice with children. Theory and practice are very interconnected. Sometimes there is this idea that theory comes from an outer academic world or something, and practice is what really happens. But theory and practice are interconnected. Practice doesn't happen in a vacuum. Practice doesn't come out of nowhere. It is very connected to theory. And daily practices, rules, routines, and habitual words and phrases are grounded in theories that shape what is expected from children and how the role of the educator is viewed. So what theories underpin our practices? Where do what theories are that we working with? And what do we take for granted as truth without actually thinking more deeply about where these truths have come from? And there's a very, very dominant story, theory that has become the truth of our early childhood education practices. And that is child development theories, which arose out of developmental psychology, and is a very Euro-Western model of looking at children, that sees children as a universal their learning and progression in universal linear ways that we can predict, that we have ways of measuring that progression, that we have our teaching practices and our thinking about children can be, we apply the correct technologies, we apply the correct, give the correct information and expect to particular skills at particular ages, and that we can apply those universal ways of thinking about children to all children, no matter who, where they are, what culture they are. We can, that all children learn and think and develop in particular ways that we can predict and measure. So these two child development theories privilege certain voices, knowledges, and understandings by suggesting universal ways of thinking about children, educators, and communities, while other perspectives are marginalized or silenced. So what does developmentalism do? Developmentalism defines who a normal child should be. Of course, normal is in quotes there. And therefore calls for fixing children who do not meet predetermined, i.e. normal standards. It defines good practice as a formula to produce predetermined outcomes and to produce good citizens, and universalizes children and educators within Euro-Western logics, erasing non-Western perspectives. So this child developmentalism has become so ubiquitous because we've held it within our Euro-Western societies for so long. It is understood as truth, and our childhood educational programs and elementary school programs are all based on developmentalism. We group all the 3-year-olds together, the 4-year-olds together, the 6-year-olds together, the 7-year-olds together. And when we do that, we expect all those 7-year-olds to have the same predictable outcomes at the end of grade 2 or 3 or whatever that is, so that then they're ready to move to the next grade. All of our programming, our materials, blocks have a particular developmental ideology attached to them. Dolls have a particular developmental ideology attached to them, except the way we have our routines, our language. Crisscross applesauce, put your feet crisscross your feet. But there's so many phrases and habitual ways of doing that have been derived from developmentalism. It's just understood as the best way, as the truth, as normal. So to think outside of that takes some real critical thinking. It takes some real deep critical reflection to think deeply about how embedded we are within developmentalism and how Euro-Western it is, and how it therefore excludes so many people and does huge violence and has done huge violence to so many people. Education has been an apparatus of colonization to remove Indigenous children from their land, culture, languages, and traditions through the residential school system. Education that removes Indigenous people from their knowledges is not an artifact of history. It continues today. So as I said before, education can be a conduit for real social change, but education can also be a tool for oppression and violence. And we have witnessed that this has been going on in our country for decades and decades and decades. And we've recognized that education can be a violent tool for colonialism. And developmentalism was the model that those educational practices were based on. Marie Baptiste, an amazing scholar who has studied this deeply and has written so eloquently about it, says the add and stir model of bringing Aboriginal education into curriculum, environment, and teaching practice has not achieved the needed change, but rather continues to sustain the superior Eurocentric knowledge and processes. And we've seen lots of attempts to bring in Indigenous thinking and ways of doing into education and early childhood education with frameworks and with programs. And not to say that those aren't great steps forward, they are. But as Marie Baptiste says, that sort of an add and stir model, because our system itself is so steeped in developmentalism that we're sort of adding some icing to a cake that's really not going to change. The system itself is steeped into Euro-Western logics and excludes so many other ways of thinking and doing. So critically reflecting on what that means and what that means for what we do with our programs, with our children, with our communities, I think is extremely important. So how do we begin to re-envision the educational system? We've got all these things that we've been thinking about that we want to reflect on, but what do we do with that? What do we want? How do we start? What can we do? And that is opening up dialogues about what is knowledge, opening up dialogues about education and learning to create space for multiple ways of thinking about knowledge and the purpose of education. So understanding the plurality, the diversity of ways of thinking about knowledge, that there are many ways to think about learning, many ways to think about what knowledge is important, many ways to think about the purpose of education. These dialogues are important as a means of challenging the dominance of child development theories formulated within the discipline of developmental psychology. So through these dialogues, as I said earlier, we don't want to just have dialogues. We don't want to just talk about it. We need to be critically reflecting in these dialogues. And the critical is the word that's really important there. We really have to interrogate what we think about and how the dominance of child development theories have impacted our teaching practices, our settings, our materials, our children, our communities. So critical reflection is one of the processes that we can use to engage with, to challenge these dominant ways of thinking. But the framework also puts forward three other ways of thinking about it. And the first is the pedagogy of listening. We could do a whole 2-hour session just on the pedagogy of listening because there's a lot to think about there. But briefly, what that means is letting go of the lens of assessing skills and development, rather listening to children with a deep sense of attunement, to be in an expansive relationship, to share and invent theories. So the pedagogy of listening is hearing children for who they are and not trying to change them into the other or change them into the same. Accepting the other is what the term the scholarship uses, to accepting the other without judgment, and not trying to judge and make the child into the same. So that kind of listening, we do a lot of listening, or we think that we do, but sometimes we only listen until we hear what we think we should be hearing. The children are very good at it, of making sure they say what we think they are expected to say, or to behave in a way that they think is the right way that they are expected to behave. So if we are truly listening to children and without judgment, we are listening to them more deeply and accepting what they're saying as theories, as experimenting, as inventions in a relationship of reciprocity, where we are not transmitting knowledge to them, rather we are co-constructing knowledge together. So listening means not already knowing, rather thinking with others, creating space for uncertainty, experimentation, innovation, and creativity. So those are 4-year-olds using power tools, just so you know. So sort of expanding what we think is possible. And that's kind of deep listening means not only listening to the words children use, but also to their actions, to their drama, to their dance, to their art, to their movement, to their sculpture, paying attention to all the expressive ways that children communicate. It also means being the pedagogy of listening includes not just thinking and listening with children, but to the families that children live with, the communities, paying attention and accepting without judgment those communities, those families, and creating space for uncertainty, that we are not, teachers not being the expert and not having all the knowledge, but building knowledge together. The next process is collaborative dialogue, which in collaborative dialogue means inviting comments, questions, and interpretations from children, families, colleagues, and community members to elicit multiple perspectives. And this idea of multiple perspectives is something that's very key to this whole process, recognizing that there are many ways of thinking about education and knowledge, and not just about education and knowledge, but also about small moments. For example, that child on the balance beam in the bare feet with all the tubes below them, where there's many ways to look at that moment, the everyday moments. There's many ways of interpreting those, and gathering those many perspectives broadens how we see the world. It broadens how we see children and families. So having an interdisciplinary collaborative dialogue, where we're not just in the world of early childhood talking about early childhood, we expand our conversations as far beyond people who are involved in early childhood, so to the broader community, and invite multiple, the perspectives of multiple families, members, colleagues, the bus driver, the people that are picking up the garbage, anybody that will listen, anybody that will talk, engaging everyone into the collaborative dialogue about what we mean about education, learning, and knowledge. And finally, pedagogical narration, which is the process of noticing and collecting moments from daily practice and sharing these with colleagues, children, and families. The intention is not to represent what happened, but how you are thinking about what you heard or saw. So pedagogical narration is something that we can use to generate collaborative dialogue within a pedagogy of listening, using a critically reflective lens. It's taking a moment. It can be a video moment, it can be a written moment, it can be a photograph, but it's not, as this quote says, it's not about just saying what happened, but it's inviting conversation about what happened. So in this picture, this educator and child, this community of educators and children have created what they've called a living wall. And they were doing an investigation into the forest that was outside of their childcare center. And over months and weeks, probably years, they collected traces of photographs of branches, of twigs, of notes and quotes, and built a pedagogical narration that told many stories and elicited many perspectives. So that is one way to do a pedagogical narration. Of course, there's many, many ways of doing pedagogical narrations, but the point of them is to collect traces and use those traces for generating dialogue. So with that, this is a pedagogical narration that I'm going to share with you. This is the photograph that I will share, and I will tell a story about it. After that, I have some reflective questions that I will share with you as well, and then we will go into the breakout groups to hopefully you can have some discussion about this story. So this story took place in a childcare program where I was a pedagogist in Victoria. This is the childcare yard. And this story was told to me by an educator named Colleen. And Colleen said that a 4-year-old child and she were looking at this tree that grew in their yard. And the 4-year-old boy said to Colleen, look at that tree. Look at how all those branches came down together and joined at the trunk and into the ground. And Colleen looked at the tree, and her immediate thought was, well, of course, that's wrong. That is not how a tree grows. That is not the truth. That is not the right story about this tree. That is not the truth about how this tree grows. But being reflective, she stopped herself from immediately. She thought to herself, that is one story about a tree, but there are many other stories about trees. There are many ways of thinking about trees. This tree has the biology of this tree is one story about how that tree grows. The facts about how that tree grows is a particular story about that tree, but there are many other stories about this tree. There are people who have understandings of trees in many different ways, and trees elicit many different kinds of creative responses. There are people that dance to express themselves through trees. They're inspired by trees in dance, in art, in music, in drama. People trees carry knowledge. They are knowledge holders and have inspire people in different ways culturally. Trees have now been understood to communicate underground with each other and connect with each other and nourish each other and other living beings. People become very, very passionate about trees. They chain themselves to trees to prevent destruction of trees. Trees are a very powerful source of inspiration for so many ways of being and doing. Those are powerful, powerful stories that come from trees. She also thought about the story that this boy had told her about the tree, and how if she said, yes, that's a great story, but it's not the truth, would he ever share other stories that he had? Would he ever share other theories that he'd developed if she was telling him that his theory was not a good theory, that it was not a correct theory, and her theory was the right theory, and his was the wrong theory? So all of this went through her mind. And in the end, she said, yep, look at how those branches all came together and went down into that trunk and into the ground. So there's some questions to think about, to critically reflect on that story, to think about the concept of knowledge, about what knowledge is important, and who gets to decide what knowledge is important. Let us know what you were thinking about.
Nina here. I would love to share what we talked about in our group, if that's okay.
Please, thank you.
Yeah, we all appreciated this perspective on learning, and we talked a little bit about what we thought the effects of it might be. So we reflected on the fact that there's a danger right now that many people don't necessarily believe in a certain truth, for example, about science. And we wondered how that fits in. And my group members were sharing about their backgrounds with education and how many of them experienced an education that was very narrow. It was based on one truth: listen to the teacher, read your books, reflect back exactly verbatim what you've been taught. And I really appreciated their reflections about how that actually narrowed their ability to, or felt that narrows a person's ability to actually deeply understand material, and that with less certainty, it actually promotes more thinking and more reflection and more understanding. But also that this approach that you're sharing with us is also about listening and openness. So it's not just about everyone having their own truth. It's about being open to others' truths, and then really thinking about what makes sense for you. So I really appreciated my group members' thoughts on that, and it was a lovely discussion.
Yeah, it sounds like a lovely discussion. And is it sort of like thinking about having to unlearn what we think we know about education, perhaps?
Yes, I think so. And it was interesting to hear some of my group members who were educated in one way and then watched their children educated differently, and being able to compare and being so happy about their children being allowed to think in their own ways more, and how they felt that showed that resulted in a deeper understanding of what they'd been learning about.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
It's nice to see that comparison.
Yeah. And what does that mean for us as educators? What is that, the image of the educator in that role? What are we to do in that role when we are no longer the transmitters of knowledge and the expert? So what does that make us? What are we doing differently now?
Yeah, I just kind of want to thank you for all this great opportunity that we all kind of having great of a time, kind of like rethinking what is the pedagogy means to us. Recently that I actually work with one of the pedagogists that she actually inspired me a lot of stuff I would like to share with everybody here. When we talk about pedagogy, when we talk about the image of the children, but actually an image of an educator, but what is the image of population? That's what we're talking about. And also what's education and like education means to everybody. I actually had a great chat with one of the professor in CAP that she also gave me quite a thinking. Educational is political. Like we all tend to be wanting creating some maths routine, whatever, all the kind of age, but we tend to forget we're still in that box. So we actually never jump out, making the pedagogy in the real practice in the real life. So I feel that because when I heard about like the Kim, all that your presentation there, I feel is really important that to me that pedagogy, what I mean by pedagogy is process. We actually as educators, sometimes we cannot really listen to the children that telling us that. But how are we going to really using that proactive listening, being a collaborative partner? That's how I'm finding out is really important, that kind of reflecting the educator self and how we really kind of like be the partner learning with them together. Like the place trying to for myself, I'm actually kind of like learning from inspiring myself as well, because I have my daughter and I'm trying to see what is the best way. But sometimes I forget there's no such a best way. It's trying to find a way in the learning journey with her together. So I do kind of having like the perspective that I had in my group, and she also kind of like gave me some good perspective from her working place and everything. I feel it's kind of important, essential that we have those communication, as we call it, communication with everyone. So this is how we gonna learning which each educator's background and understanding how really can promoting this pedagogy learning with children. I was kind of like rethinking a lot of stuff. Sorry if I can't hold everybody, but this is a great opportunity that we definitely, as an educator, how we're going to carry forward with everybody's words and also kind of learning from children's words. Yeah, that's what I want to kind of share right now.
Yeah, those are great thoughts. So thank you so much for sharing that, because those are all really interesting. You know, that's what we're all doing, is trying to figure out, it's not, as you said, not one best way, because there is not one best way, but I think looking at words like experimentation, innovation, invention, new possibilities, potentiality. So like those kinds of words rather than best or one way. So I thank you for sharing that. I think there was Monica, were you wanting to say something?
Sure, yeah, hi. Thanks for this platform, and thanks for everybody for participating in our group. I think we're related to what both the earlier participants were saying about really critically thinking the juxtaposition of maybe what we're learning today about critical reflection of what we already do in our practice versus the societal pressure for acknowledging facts as the predominant discourse for knowledge. So knowledge equals facts is sort of the underlying equation that we all maybe grew up with and we adapted in our cellular system, but it's also in the fabric of society. So we talked a little bit about the challenge that we come feeling like, you know, or well, I share that I feel like sometimes it's just like a drop in the ocean of what we're trying to do in terms of changing the overall societal image of children and practice of learning. And what does that mean for everybody? And I think because we've been in this situation of factual and of being certain in certainty, like living in certainty, in my certainty, it closes a lot of the perspective, understanding, and collaboration and moving forward of ideas and thus create our state of being in the world. But it's still a discourse that challenges us as facilitators of learning or just human being alongside children. And so we didn't really have a reconciliation of that, like what are we going to move forward with, except for that it's something that we want to practice, that we are unlearning ourselves as well, but also that hopefully with technology and opening the possibility of learning, that doesn't need to happen in a 4-wall space with one person in a classroom of 20 to 23 of your same age peers, can be quite freeing and experimental. So echoing your words, Kim. So that's kind of what we discussed in our short time together.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I really appreciate your comments and how thoughtful all the thoughtfulness you bring to them. I just want to pick up on one thing that you said. Well, there's lots of things to pick up, but one that just twigged to me is, you feel like a drop in the ocean sometimes, and how much can we actually do, because our society is so imbued with these facts and teaching in that kind of narrow way. And I come to Peter Moss's words, who always says we can't. There's minor politics and major politics, and the major politics are the policymakers and the governmental folks who create policies and so forth, and we need those people. But then there's the minor politics, which are the everyday practices that all of us do moment by moment by moment, and how much those moments matter, and how much we need to connect with others who are also working in those innovative, experimental, creative, uncertain ways, and come together in communities of practice, because that we can't wait for the policymakers to change how things are done. We have to do it ourselves. That is our ethical responsibility, to advocate for this. And the way that we can do that is by doing it day by day, by moment, and talking about it with others. And this is what Iris has spent a decade or two working with, and can speak to probably much more eloquently than I can, that this kind of pedagogical leadership that comes from those of us in the classrooms doing the work and making changes in those kinds of and making connections with others that are doing it. And that's how change is going to come.
And Linda said, we discussed about we're co-learners. Our job as educators is provoke situations for critical thinking. And Teresa said, I love that less certainty provides space for more thought. I think this is relating to your words, Kim. Bahara says, we share that it is important to listen and step back and do not answer questions, rather ask more questions, open-ended questions. So I wonder if there's something you want to respond to that. And Jenny says, I wasn't able to join the conversation in my breakout room, but I think re-examining our practice daily while appreciating the value of critical thinking is very positive philosophy. I think listening and critical thinking are vital skills for people, all people, big and small, and especially in the role of an educator. And Alexandra says, for us, knowledge is so important that we all get to share what we think and take turns for others to share their thoughts. Listening to others' perspective gives us the opportunity for a bigger picture. And Fateme, who I know, says, for us, all knowledge is important, precious, and to be respected. Knowledge is created in collaboration with everything and everyone, and that is what makes it valuable and inclusive. And Mari, that I think you know, Kim, says, getting rid of the word best when it comes to working with children and listening and understanding. Nitika says, we can share our personal experience with children and provide them resources and observe what they're doing, how they're reacting, set the activity that is total child-oriented. For instance, make tracks, but track doesn't mean only for vehicle. It can be used by animals or any other thing. Let the children explore. It enhances their knowledge and imagination. It leads to new inventors in the future. However, we can we can give them indirect directions so that it all leads to safe play. And again, there might be something that you want to respond to that, Kim. So maybe I'll stop here because there are quite a bit more, and I'm worried about it getting lost if we don't kind of pause for a minute and reflect on what has been said already.
Yeah, there's lots there with a
there
very
is
rich conversations. It's wonderful. So one thing I thought about was people were somebody mentioned about guiding or expanding what children were thinking and asking open-ended questions. And that made me think of what you were talking about earlier, Iris, about developing theories, about thinking about what children tell us as theories, and how does that shift how we see or think or do with the theories that they bring to us, with the ideas that they bring to us. And then it makes me, you were saying about expanding those theories. How do you allow children to create opportunities, giving them opportunities to expand on their theories? So that's quite different than an open-ended question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to continue what you were talking about with that, Iris?
Well, I was thinking that, asking another question might be a way to respond or engage, but sometimes offering children the opportunity to think about their theories through different media is also a possibility. So what if you asked a child to draw their theory, or maybe they can experiment with thinking with that particular theory in using clay or wire, and how might this expand or helps the child come up with refining their theory, or maybe rethinking their theory that the tree grows in that particular way coming from the sky. So I think thinking with but also beyond questions might be something for us to explore. So that's one thing. And the other thing that we quickly chatted about is the importance of using those critical thinking and those moments for curriculum making. So how might these conversations with children lead to maybe bigger conversations with additional children, and to all kinds of things that you co-create with children within or outside of your classroom? So how do you make these conversations part of your, you mentioned the word collective research. So how do you make it part of your collective research with young children? There's lots of comments in the chat, and I know we have a limited amount of time. And just thinking out loud that perhaps take a moment to read beautiful reflections. And I know, Kim, that you have prepared another pedagogical narration to work with. Maybe the invitation is for now to read the comments in the chat, and I actually look to you to decide how you want to move forward.
Okay, I just wanted to add to the conversation from the chat and from what you've been saying as well, because this shift in the role of the educator can be unsettling, because we've gone from a place of being certain and being in control and manage and knowing the outcome, so we can project what the day is going to look like. So we're shifting away from that to thinking about not knowing, to thinking about uncertainty, to thinking about and not having a particular prescribed outcome, and how unsettling that can be, and having to embrace that feeling of being unsettled and work with that feeling of uncertainty and embrace that. But the flip side is sometimes one can therefore think it's a free-for-all. I can just let children go and think and do and experiment, and off they go, and I'm just the observer and provide some materials. But that couldn't be farther from the truth. It's not that we're absenting ourselves as educators. We are very much there and very much involved as co-researchers and thinking together alongside children. And so we're not just facilitating. We are involved as a participant in constructing knowledge. And our place in that is just as important as the place of the children. We are not secondary. We were talking about that hierarchy before. We're flattening that hierarchy. We're not abstaining ourselves from the construction of knowledge. We're participating as well. So that, I think, again, we do that through experimentation with a lot of uncertainty, but it's not that we're just letting things go and we're standing back and watching the chaos. There might be chaos, but we're involved in the chaos, if you know what I mean. So I think that is important to state, because I think these conversations could be taken in a way that makes us think as educators that our role is to just sort of let children go for it. And that's not what we're putting forward here. Does somebody else want to take that idea up or not?
I see a note in the chat that Cindy
Yeah.
has her hand up.
Hi. Nice. Thank you for giving us this platform to speak and share our knowledge. In our breakout room, I spoke a little bit to the essence of like Indigenous knowledge and ways of being. I'm from the Klahoose Nation, and I have the opportunity in our local school district to teach language and culture. And so it's like this marriage of bringing this knowledge of children and their way of being and Indigenous ways of educating into a space it's like putting a circle in a square box. It doesn't really fit. And so it kind of goes along with our talk here today, in the fact that, so I didn't get to say this in our breakout room, but what I was going to say was, traditionally in our culture, we have, say, legends, and we have these legends about Mink, and he teaches the children all these stories because he gets to these ridiculous antics, and he's a funny character, but he's also has lots of lessons to learn. And it's from the place of, he teaches people what not to do. So kids of all ages can hear the exact same story. They will take the knowledge from that story and internalize it and learn lessons to where they're at. So it's meeting the children. So it's this big, huge, broad knowledge base. And it's not necessarily expecting outcomes. You should learn this from it. You should know this from it. And so it's a beautiful way of looking at this model of being with kids and children and teaching them about how to be. But having us step back, we can provide the scaffold and the parameters, but they get to decide and be where they land. So that to me was kind of a nice way to reflect and view these three questions that we had laid out.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great observation and a great story, and storytelling, the power of stories. That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Maybe I will share now that, or Mari, were you wanting to say something?
Hi, I really connected with what Cindy just said right now. I didn't want to take time from your narration about children deciding where they want to be and where they land, and how this inspiration comes from this well, I call it person, but it's like a person, Mink, who is teaching and telling them about, what is safe or not safe, or what is out there. That was a bit of the conversation that we had in our group too, and about how to really learn with the children what is out there from their perspective, and how to also address other educators or parents' concerns when we would be out there, for example, learning with natures and about risks and all of that. But through Cindy's way of storytelling, then it takes another dimension, because it's so much connected with who the children are in their culture. So just a quick thought. Of course, everybody's saying the same, more time for these conversations. So thank you, Kim. And yeah, I'm eager to hear your next narrative.
Thank you for that, Mari. Thank you. Okay, so I will share my screen now, and we'll just hope it works. So those are the critically reflective questions. So here's the second pedagogical narration, and there's actually no story that goes with this. The image pretty much shared is the story. So this was a photograph that I took in a program that I was working out as a pedagogist, and this was this kind of collection of chairs was a regular occurrence, and I do have some critically reflective questions to go along with this, but I want you to be able to absorb the photo for a few moments before I move it to the questions. But here's the questions. How do chairs live in early years spaces? What do we expect from chairs? And what do chairs invite bodies to do? And focus apart from the children. And I'm very interested to know what your discussions were about. Were they about the chairs? Were they about the questions about the chairs? Please do share.
Someone in my group brought up something that I had never thought about before, and it really fascinated me. Is we're sort of shifting to the new, and these are her words, like sitting is the new smoking. So do we need chairs in ECE at all? And should we just get rid of them, raise the tables a bit so the kids can stand at them? And we've got multi-height tables, and often our kids will stand for art and Play-Doh and stuff. And we recently, I think a couple months ago, stopped telling our kids to sit while they're eating. And our new guideline is your body needs to be still. Because we were finding some of our new kiddos weren't eating. They were jacking the boxes, and we couldn't, when we asked them to sit, they kind of stopped eating, goofed around, packed up their lunch and left. So we decided to see how we felt as a group if we just let go of the sit down. Just be still so you don't choke. Like, so you can stand beside the table, you can rock back and forth a little bit, but you don't have to sit. And so what if we took away all the chairs and got our kids moving more? I don't know, it fascinated me, and it's really got my brain going.
Yeah, it's a good question. I worked in a center as a pedagogist where we had this conversation about chairs, and the educator took away, the educator in the Strong Start room and a primary teacher took away about half the chairs in the classroom to experiment with that. I think that's really interesting to think about, as you've said, what are our expectations around chairs? We have very clear ideas about how chairs should be used and what children should be doing with chairs. So what happens, as you've said, what happens if we let go of that? Other people, other comments?
We were talking about, I'm sorry. I'll wait.
I think Jessica, go ahead.
Oh, okay. We were talking about first the environment as the third teacher, right? How the environment can't provoke some actions and also invitations, right? We were thinking about how sometimes is an invitations to use their gross motor skills, right? When sometimes when they see chairs, is risk taking, and as we saw, this girl was sitting on 3 chairs and was a little bit of risk taking. Seems like she was capable of doing it, and the educator let her do it. So that's confidence. Like she feels like, okay, they're letting me do it because they trust me. So chairs can invite children to do those kind of things, like climbing, reaching for things. What I've noticed that it depends of the chair and how you use it. If you are forcing children to sit, or not forcing, but encourage them just to use them as we're supposed to use them sitting. But I had an example in my circle time. There is one child that always go and grab a rocking chair. We only have one, and somehow the other ones are okay with it. And he really likes it, and he's engaged with our circle time, with whatever is happening, or story time. He just needs that chair. For him, that chair, I don't know, brings comfort, or his learning styles that he needs to move a little, but he reaches for that chair every time we say, hey, let's gather. Chairs, another way that we use chairs is in our center is we have our quiet corner with comfy chairs, more like sofas. And I see children that go and snuggle there with a book when they want peace and quiet. So I think that it depends on how chairs are used and what are we doing with them. Mm-hmm. We're just saying, just sit and work with me and ABC, then not. But if we're just let them use as they please, or they feel like they need to, is we're letting the children be making their own choices. And also we're talking about the risk taking, that sometimes they're using just to jump, or I see them doing a little bit of crazy stuff with the chairs, but they're not using it just to sit and be quiet and stay still. So that was
yeah.
Oh, hi, I'm Tammy. Maybe I can say something first while waiting.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I just want to say I totally agree with Jessica. Sometimes I do feel like the chair in some setting in the school, it provides some sense of security for some children. Like we have some little, like really nice, sofas and at the book corner, and we do have a few kids when they feel like down or tired, they like to go sit there and kind of snuggle with a little bit like stuffies and read books over there. But and then we do have some like a little chairs that provide sense of the security for the children who needs it. So I do feel like the chairs in the role is really different in the classroom settings. They all have a different role and provide different purpose.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about what our purpose for chairs are and what our rules
Right.
for chairs are.
Yeah, exactly.
And what our expectations for chairs. Can children and the management that chairs sometimes require of
right, yeah, it definitely. Now, like some place we do feel like, oh, the circle time, we like to stay in the circle on the carpet, and children are feel free to participate. And but that's the part we feel like, oh, I feel like the chair can be away from that area, give children more like freedoms and the power of like engaging in the discussions and all the things we want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's all I like to say. But yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Tammy. Bahara, can we hear you now?
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We talked about different purposes of using chair and the rules around it. So I just want to mention about one highlight that still I'm in shock with is that still there are centers who use chairs at like timeout chairs, even in toddler centers, and I am speechless. That's it.
Oh, yeah. That's a sad. I'm sad to hear that. I'm very sad to hear that. And I think about the chairs as a controlling body. So like we are. Don't sit sideways on your chairs. Don't sit backwards on your chairs. Don't tip the chair upside down. Chairs are a way of regulating bodies quite often, and that's the putting it, the most extreme way is to sit in your chair as a form of punishment. That's definitely a power, an imbalance of power, and power using chairs as a regulator of bodies.
Hi, Kim. Again. Sorry. I am noting the time.
You're right.
And I know you have prepared some slides to conclude this conversation. And I just wanted to take a very quick moment Number one, please read the comments in the chat. These are part of our conversation. But I also wanted to thank you, Kim, because I'm not so sure I'll have time to do it at the end. and I really wanted to thank you for giving us the permission to think about chairs, because that is a great way for all of us to think that there are no dull moments. It is really about paying attention. It is really about being attuned. It is really finding the extraordinary in the ordinary and taking that moment to think, how is this event or object can help us think differently. And I think your questions for the pedagogical narration, even though one was about knowledge and the other one was about chairs, were very, very similar in so many ways in what they generated. The other thing I wanted to point out is the amazing group and thoughts that have been shared here, which brings me right back to your comment about minor politics and the importance of all of us contributing to changing the narrative about what early childhood education is and what it can be about. Maybe the last thing that I will say is in the group that I joined, what became apparent very, very quickly is that we were doing pedagogical narration when we were there. This is doing pedagogical narration, this getting together, this different perspectives. Of course, we didn't document them perhaps, but this is the kind of work that we're doing, and then opening up to more perspectives. So I'll leave it with that. We have about 4 minutes, and again, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Kim, for opening windows and doors for us. And I will quickly mention that we do have one more event in this series. It's going to be in June, so we have a bit of time, and it will focus on social justice. So maybe we'll see some of you then. Kim?
Okay, thank you so much, Iris. So I'm going to share the screen just for a last couple of slides. There we go. So what we've been engaging in here is a community of practice, and we have had short bits, just a taste of it in those breakout rooms and in the larger group to discuss. But community of practice is inviting educators to think deeply about issues and moments from their practice, not to find final answers or truths, but to generate richer, meaningful pedagogical understandings. And as Iris pointed out, I think sometimes we lose sight of the moment. Sometimes we get onto the issues, and there's issues that we should keep our eyes on, no doubt whatsoever, but it's also the moments and those small moments of talking about chairs, which actually are kind of big moments, I think. So paying attention to those moments within a community of practice is so enriching. So I hope that this will inspire further dialogue with your own community of practice, and I hope that becomes a way of professional thinking that you can continue to participate in. So just some concluding thoughts to send you off with. My good friend and colleague Danielle Davis says the politics of niceness, sacrificing our values and pedagogy so as not to offend others. We need to normalize the act of critically reflective questioning. So we don't want to think that asking questions and being critically reflective with one another is rude. We want that to become part of the culture. We're not thinking about it as offending someone, that we take that on as the way of being in this space, the way of thinking together in this space, and making that, normalizing that, as Danielle said. So taking that as a way of being culturally within our programs, within our community of early childhood educator, making that a regular part of how we do things. And if we want spaces of inclusion, diversity, and new pedagogical possibilities, we can't live within old paradigms, i.e. routines that keep children busy and adhere to health and safety guidelines. that comes back to that question of what does quality mean? And in fact, the use of the word quality should probably be finished. We should just not use that word because it's so meaningless now. So we want, considering new ways of thinking so that we can have multiple perspectives, plurality, diversity, inclusion, and pedagogical possibilities. And finally, what kind of world do we want to live in, and what kind of people do we want to be? As Carlina Rinaldi from Reggio has famously says, school is not preparation for life, school is life. And so in that life, who do we want to be, and what kind of world do we want to live in this life that we live with children and communities? So I will leave you with that. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this session with you. And again, I so appreciate your time on this sunny Saturday. And luckily the sun is still out, and you have hopefully the rest of the day to enjoy it and think together while you're out walking in the sunshine. So thank you again, Iris, for inviting me. And thank you so much for your participation today.